Have you been lied to about creation? Are there some things that you've heard in church or on television or even here on YouTube that aren't actually in the Bible? I mean, what does the Bible really say about how the earth was formed and how that compares with the things we learn in science? Well, if you want to know the real answers to these and other questions, then join me for this episode of Misreading Scripture. But first, if you're interested in learning some simple strategies that will make studying the Bible easier than ever before, then make sure to click the link above and down in the description where you can download a free resource I created called 5 Bible Study Strategies. In this resource, I give you simple, concise strategies for studying the Bible that you can apply quickly and begin to see immediate results, just like in this video. In fact, speaking of, let's dive in. Now, the first thing that most people don't know about the creation story is that it's written from a very different mindset and with a greatly different perspective than most of us have. The truth is, the people who recorded this account of creation saw the world differently than most of us do today. They viewed it in the mindset of people living in the Near East thousands of years ago. People who had never seen pictures of space or traveled across an ocean or even heard of science. And because of that, they understood the world in a way that feels primitive to most of us. For instance, on day 2, Genesis recounts how God said, "Let there be a vaulted dome in the midst of the waters, and let it cause a separation between the waters." So God made the vaulted dome, and he caused a separation between the waters, which were under the vaulted dome, and between the waters, which were over the vaulted dome. And it was so. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably found this confusing when you read it as a child, or even as an adult. I mean, what in the world is this vaulted dome that Scripture's talking about? But if you were living several thousands of years ago in the Near East, this would have made perfect sense. And that's because people in that region at that time believed that when they looked up and saw a blue sky, that blue sky was water being held back by a giant divider or dome or firmament or whatever you want to call it. Right? Sometimes that dome would open and would allow rain to fall down to the earth, but either way, that blue was water on the other side. Similarly, they also believed that not only was there water above the earth, there was also water below it, underneath the earth. There was water that was being held back in a similar fashion, and this explains why when Noah faces the giant flood in Genesis 7, it says that all the springs of the great deep were split open and the windows of heaven were opened up. What it's saying is that the vaults above and below opened up to allow the waters to come forth. But this isn't the only way that the biblical authors saw the world differently. For instance, on day 1, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But here's the strange thing. Even though there was light upon the earth, God had not yet created the sun, right? That won't come until day 4. And that's because in the Near East, they thought that the sun wasn't necessarily the earth's primary source of light. They believed that light also came from the moon and the stars. And so what seems scientifically impossible for us or requires creative explanation made complete sense to them. And that actually leads us to the next important thing that most people don't know about the creation story, which is that the creation story in the Bible has a unique purpose. One of the things I teach people who are trying to better understand the Bible is that one of the first things you have to do when studying a passage is to recognize and surrender your biases. We all approach Scripture with our own perspectives and purposes, often without realizing it. For instance, when we hear Jesus talk about the importance of children, we immediately hear those words through the filter of whatever our culture values about children, whether that is their innocence or their simple faith or whatever else we might value. And without realizing it, we interpret the text through that lens. Well, in a similar way, the culture we live in causes us to approach the creation story with a different purpose or with a unique purpose without necessarily realizing it. We expect the creation story to give us a scientific explanation for how the world was created. We expect it to answer our questions about nature, history, biology, and the scientific beginnings of the cosmos. But what if that's not what the Bible's trying to do? What if that wasn't even on the minds of those who recorded the creation story? What if that's our purpose and not the Bible's purpose? You see, while we want Genesis to give us a scientific history of the origins of the universe, it's actually trying to do something else. It's trying to give us the spiritual history of the origins of our relationship with God. Rather than trying to explain physics, astronomy, and biology, It's trying to reveal to us who God is through God's creation and what that shows us about our relationship with God. Creation explains how our relationship with God began, why God created the world, how the world became so corrupt, and how the relationship formed between humans and God at the very beginning, and how that shapes our relationship with God today. And this is where it is so important to remember that this creation account wasn't created in a vacuum. It wasn't recorded in isolation, wholly separate from the world at that time. It was very much written with the world in mind. In fact, that leads to the next place where we're often misled about the creation story, and that is when it comes to outside influences. You see, when we look closely, we can see that there are many similarities between the biblical account of creation and other accounts at that time in that region. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the biblical authors were simply stealing from these other accounts to create their own. Quite the opposite, actually. The Bible is drawing upon these other accounts in order to tell a much different story. The God of the Israelites is a much different God than the gods of the nations that surround them, and the creation story intends to make that quite clear. For instance, on the fifth day, God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kind. Now that word that we translate sea creatures is the Hebrew word Tanin, and it's a word that definitely would have caught the attention of early listeners. You see, Tanin is a reference to the creatures who serve the god Yam in Canaanite mythology. Yam is depicted as a leviathan, a giant sea creature. So by saying that God created Tanin, Israel is claiming the Lord's superiority over Canaanite gods. The Lord isn't simply like all the other gods. God is supreme, greater than all of the other gods. And unlike the other gods who cause chaos or ignore the suffering of those experiencing it, God orders the chaos. And that actually leads to the final place where we are often misled about the creation story, which is that we are not taught that there is an intentional pattern to the creation story. Rather than simply being a list of events, the creation story has a pattern. For 3 days, God creates and divides. On day 1, God creates light and separates light from darkness, forming the heavens. On day 2, God separates the waters above from the waters below, forming the sky and the seas. On day 3, God separates dry land from the seas. And then for the next 3 days, God fills each of these. On day 4, God fills the heavens with the sun, the moon, and the stars. On day 5, God fills the sky with birds and the seas with fish and other creatures. And on day 6, God fills the land with animals and humans. And then on the final day, God rests. And all of this is meant to tell us who our God is and proclaim it to the world. This is no typical God of that time in that region. This is not a God of chaos and violence. At that time, people believed that the gods were responsible for practically everything that happened in their lives: birth, death, storms, floods, famines, droughts. The gods were temperamental and unpredictable. People lived in fear of the chaos around them. And in this creation story, we see a bold declaration that this is not who our God is. Ours is not a God who brings storms and floods upon the people. Ours is not a God who abuses humanity and delights in our suffering. Ours is not a God who shows little interest in our insignificance. Ours is a God who brings order and peace to the world in which we live. A God who cares for us and provides for us. A God who reigns above all the other gods. And perhaps most surprising of all, a God who rests and who will teach us to do the same. Ours is a God who in the chapters to come in Genesis will see humans ruin the creation God so carefully ordered, who will show grace and forgiveness, and who will go on to give even more guidance to God's creation for how to live in this world that can feel so chaotic and so dangerous. Ours is a God who loves, who is involved, and all of that is still true. You see, while the creation story may not be trying to answer all of our scientific questions, it's giving us answers to much more important questions. It helps us to understand the world around us. It gives us hope and promise. And most importantly, it reveals to us a God who truly loves us, who is just as interested and involved now as God was at the dawn of time. In a world still filled with so many little gods, not the foreign deities of biblical times, but very real idols like money and power and materialism. In a world where these gods still vie for our hearts and yet offer nothing but chaos, Genesis reminds us of who our God truly is. that we worship the God above all other gods, and that in the end, the message remains the same. This is the God of our hope. This is the God of our salvation. And this is the God who deserves all of our praise. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you'd like to learn more strategies that will make studying the Bible easier and more fruitful than it ever has been before, then make sure to click the link above or down in the description to download my free resource called 5 Bible Study Strategies. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, videos that will change the way you see familiar passages of the Bible, then just click this link over here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.